Well, it's beginning to look a lot like Christmas. Have you noticed that around here? If I were to ask you the question, though, so what does Christmas look like? I mean, that's what the song says. It looks like Christmas. What does it look like? I think one of the obvious things we would say is, well, all the Christmas decorations. You saw the church building, it's decorated, ready for Christmas. You probably noticed the big giant wreaths in this room. If you walked past them and didn't see it, wake up. They're there. All around town, you've got the Christmas lights in the homes. It's beginning to look a lot like Christmas. I throw this slide up for you, and you're seeing some of the symbols our culture has for Christmas. We got the tree decorated, or the candy cane and the ornaments and things of that sort. And likewise, we've got the colors of Christmas. And so, for example, we like our red and our green because those colors remind us that it's beginning to look a lot like Christmas. Now, in addition to cultural symbols, we've got some religious symbols as well, that when you see those, it reminds you it's beginning to look like Christmas. And so, for example, if I put this picture up on the screen with no caption, no words, you'd look at it and you'd think that's part of the Christmas story. You'd say that's the three Magi. Now, keep in mind, back in biblical times, they had camel caravans, thousands of them, traveling here and there, to and far, and they're carrying their goods. And so, in theory, that picture could be one of those caravans. You're thinking, no, that's the Christmas story. See, you see three guys on a camel, especially if there's a star in the picture, your mind immediately thinks Christmas. You're not imagining, why, that's Lawrence of Arabia. You're not thinking that. You're not thinking that's Ahab the Arab, the sheik of the burning sand, and his camel Clyde. You're not thinking that. You're thinking that's Christmas. That's the Magi. You see, there are some images that if I just give you the picture, you immediately think it's Christmas. Well, I'm giving you one of those today as we kick off this December series on Christmas. We're going to start with the Magi. Magi, their story is told in Matthew chapter 2. They're introduced to us in verses 1 and 2. Here's how Matthew tells the story of the Magi. Verse 1, he says, after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea, in the days of King Herod, Magi came from the east into Jerusalem. When they got to Jerusalem, they asked the question, where is the one that was born, King of the Jews? We saw a star in the east. We've come to worship him. And it's with those words we're introduced to the Magi. Now let me tell you more about these fellows. First, they're foreigners. Foreigners from the east. Now in your Bible translation, it will say they came from the east. In the Greek, what it says is they came from the sun rising, the rising of the sun. Now that's, of course, in the east, but there's more to that. Because that kind of phrasing, from the rising sun, is a way of saying they came from way, way far away. They're beyond the borders. They're out there from wherever the sun comes from a distant land, a distant shore. Now that's a good notation that Matthew gives us as he introduces the Magi. Because you see, they're not from around these parts. They're not from Jerusalem or Judea or even up in Galilee. You see, they're not from the land of the Jews. The Christmas story begins with Jews, Mary and Joseph, the shepherds, the people of Bethlehem who came in to see the baby they had heard about overnight. But it's in the story of the Magi, we get those who go beyond the Jews, beyond the borders of Israel. We get to the Gentiles, to the nations. And that's a good thing because that's what you and I are. Unless you're of Jewish blood, the Magi are coming close to representing us, coming to see the Christ child. They're called Magi. Now that term is an old word. It's older than the birth of Jesus. It went back several centuries, back to the land of Persia, modern-day Iran. And among the Persians, Magi were the fellows who were involved in the religion of Zoroastrianism. Now, for our purposes, it doesn't matter what Zoroastrians believe. What matters is these guys would be leaders of that faith, and they've spread throughout the world carrying that religion. Now, here's what Zoroastrian Magi were into. They were into astrology. Now, astrology is where you look at the movement of the stars and the planets and the sun, and you try to see a pattern of when good things happen, when bad things happen. And then as you read the stars and their coming movements, this is where you predict, is this a favorable time or unfavorable time to do something? A king would hire a Magi before he goes to war to let him know, if I go to war this week, is that a good week or bad week according to the stars? That's astrology. Now, that's all superstition. But astrology naturally led to astronomy. These guys, after all, were fascinated with the heavenly bodies, and so they would study them and their movements and clock the seasons, and thus they started the science of astronomy. In addition to that, they were into magic, the magic arts. You can see it from the name Magi. And so they played around with the spells and such as that. They were into alchemy. Alchemy is where you take metals, try to turn it into gold. I don't think that works, but people tried anyway. And they tried to see if they could create gold. They also were scholars. They studied esoteric knowledge. That's just knowledge from the distant past, which is a lot of legend, superstition. They studied those old things. They studied ancient texts. They studied the texts of other religions. They studied the other religions of the world, and they put all that together. And that's why sometimes you'll find it translated in your scriptures as wise men, because they were a very educated bunch in all the stuff that they pursued. You know, they're an odd lot to be showing up at the manger where Jesus was laid, because they're not Jewish. They're not part of the Jewish faith. They're something else. But you know, the story of Jesus is for everyone. It reaches out for all to come and gather around and worship him. And so they represent someone coming from afar. Now, the number of Magi, that's unknown. I know what we say. We sing, "We three kings of Orient are." So we got them down to 3. Now, if you grew up in a more Eastern tradition of Christianity, they talk about the 12 Magi. And that was the origins of the 12 days of Christmas, where a gift is given on each of the 12 days. But 3, 12, it doesn't matter. The gospel's not going to tell us which one it was. And so for our purposes, we just like to imagine that there were 3 of them based on the 3 gifts. Now, they're associated with kings. I will tell you this, though, that's not in the text. That is, when Matthew describes them, he calls them Magi. At no point does he indicate anything about royalty, that they're kings. But the idea of the Magi as kings, that started surfacing around the year 500. Don't know how it started at first, but it did, and it caught on real quickly. I'll show you a picture here. Starting around 500, we started putting crowns on the heads of the Magi in Christian art, just to let you know they were kings. Here's another picture as well, shows you they're dressed up in all their royal dandy, like they're going into court. So that became the tradition, is to describe them as kings. Now, I know what probably inspired that. The Old Testament, the prophecies of the coming Messiah. Because in some of those Old Testament prophecies, what it would say is, when Messiah comes, then the kings of the earth will come and bow before him and bring gifts to him. And so that sounds a lot like the Matthew 2 story, and I suspect that influenced this idea that they might be kings. I think the verse that really registered with so many people is Psalm 72. Psalm 72, verse 9 and 11, look how it begins. The desert tribes, the desert nomads will come and bow before the Messiah. Now that phrase, desert tribe, desert nomads, refers to those who wander out in the wilderness, making their living there. That's going to cover shepherds and the like, who have to travel for pasture and waters, and so that they live out in the doors. So those kind of people, they're going to come and bow before the Messiah, and then look what comes next, and then kings. The kings of Tarshish, the kings from a distant shore, they will come, and they'll bring their tribute. The next verse says, the kings of Sheba and Seba will come and bring their gifts, and they will bow before him. They'll serve him. The nations will serve him. I think it's this verse in particular, as well as others like it, probably inspired the idea that these were kings. Now, honestly, I don't know if they were kings or not. Could be. Could be each one was the king of some small kingdom that came over to pay honor to Jesus. Now, what's actually more likely is they were delegates of kings, because kings did this. If a king wanted to show honor to someone in another country, they didn't usually go by themselves. They sent somebody. They sent someone to represent them. You'd pick somebody pretty high up, important. Magi would fit the bill. So perhaps there's some element of truth that they represented kings of the earth. Now, whatever the case may be on these Magi and who they are, here's one thing we know. They are representatives of the nations. They represent going beyond the Jews out to the nations of the world, bringing them to Christ. They represent people like me and you, the nations, the Gentiles. Now, here's what's become a tradition in Christian art, is to take 3 and then make their faces different, their costumes different, so they can represent different nations, just to carry that idea that they represent all the nations. So, for example, you'll find them as Persian and Oriental and Arabian. And usually one will be a different face, a different costuming to represent those 3. Now, in doing that, they're picking up on diversity of the cultures. Sometimes you'll even find artists, and they'll make one of them older, one young, and then one in the middle, once again picking up on that theme, that they represent all of us with all of our differences. Along the way, somewhere we picked up names. Now here's the question, are these real names of real Magi or not, the three that visited? We don't know. It's possible somebody just made up names. It's also possible they could be for real. Because after all, whoever the real guys were that made this trip, when they went back home and Jesus grows up and become famous, I can imagine they well told their neighbors, I was there. I was one of the guys. I'm one of the ones that went and visited him. So it could be that they actually told their story back home and thus they became a legend in their own homeland and the names could be real. We don't know. But we came up with three names to at least represent what we imagine with the Magi. And of those three names, each one is different, bringing their gift. And so, for example, Melchior is usually named first. Melchior is usually portrayed as a Persian from Iran. He'll have a beard and hair that make him look older than the other two, often gray. And as he comes, he'll bring the gold. Now, Casper will come, and they'll make him look the youngest of the three. So, usually no beard. And Casper will be Oriental, more particularly India. India claims that they sent one of the Magi. You go to India, go to the churches there, especially in the southern part of India. There they talk about Apostle Thomas. Thomas came as the apostles spread out through the world. Thomas came and he evangelized India. So they claim Thomas, but they also claim Casper, that he was a delegate that sent from here to go and show respect to the Christ child. Now, the last one, Balthazar, he's the one that's going to be portrayed with a dark skin. He's Arabian, so that will fit that area. And he'll be portrayed then with a big, thick black beard, often black hair, and then he'll bring the myrrh. Now, whether any of that is actually fitting the facts or just part of the traditions that developed, it doesn't matter. You get the idea. With the three Magi, these foreigners, they represent the peoples of the world, invited to the Christ. And in doing so, they symbolize the Great Commission. See, when Jesus grows up and does his ministry, one of the things he'll do is give that famous Great Commission. Take the gospel and take it to all nations, to all the world. And even in the birth of Jesus, we already have that idea because we're seeing the nations come to Jesus in the representation of the Magi. You know, I tell you that this morning because this is a season of the year it's good for you to remember. It's a good evangelistic time. See, everybody's thinking Christmas. And whether they know about Christ very well or not, they're still getting the images of the Christ child. They know that much of the Christmas story. It's a good time to share the rest of the story. To share with them the Christ that you already know, the Christ you've accepted as Lord and Savior, and share that story with them. It's a good season of the year to tell the nations, the world, about Christ. Now, in addition to being foreigners, they're worshipers. They're worshipers of the Christ child. And you see that so clearly in this story. Now, here's what I like about these fellows. If you look at this, the brief description of the Magi, it does appear that they've got a sense of something special in this child. Listen to the words that they said. In verse 2 of Matthew chapter 2, they said, "Where is the one that's born King of the Jews? We saw his star. We've come to worship him." They've come to worship this newborn king. Now, let me tell you about that period of history. That period of history, the Magi would have been surrounded by many nations. And in all of those nations would be kings. And each king would have his brothers and his sons and his daughters. Each one of them would have their families. Children would be born frequently. And so in royal families of that ancient world, you're going to have a royal birth all the time. According to what we can tell with Magi, it wasn't their business to travel around to every royal birth and be the welcome wagon. That's not part of their job. Except in this case it is. In this case, there's something different. They have a sense of something special with this child. And thus they come to welcome the King of the Jews. We saw his star. We've come to worship him. And that tells you something about what's going on here in this story. And so they give him the royal treatment. That's how it's described in the text, the royal treatment. Verse 2, it says, we want to worship him. In verse 11, it says they came into the house. They found the child. They found his mother Mary. They bowed before him. And they worshiped him. Oh, they gave him what he deserved. And with the Magi, you have what I call a fitting finale to the Christmas story. A fitting finale. Now, they are the finale of the story, and when you and I tell the story today, they're always at the end. Because we'll start with Mary and Joseph and a donkey. We'll move from that to the baby born in the manger. We'll come to the shepherds and the angels, and then we'll finally get to the Magi. They're the finale of the story. Actually, that would be realistic. They were the final piece of the story, but not exactly the way we sometimes imagine it today. We often imagine that day when Christ was born, and that night, shepherds come in, angels are there, Magi show up. Actually, the Magi will be later. As it said in the text, Matthew chapter 2, they arrived at the house where they were staying, found the child and the mother. See, they're sometime after the others have had their time with Jesus. Now, if you think about it, this is going to make sense. That first night, there was no room in the inn, and the birth takes place in the barn. But, we're a sucker for kids. And once a baby's born, they're going to scramble. Somebody's going to offer them a place. Before you know it, they're going to be in a house. And Mary's not going to be in a condition to travel anytime soon, having just given birth. The baby's not ready for travel. They're going to need to stay for a little while. So either someone's going to welcome them into their home, and that's where they'll stay, or he'll have to rent a place, but Joseph will arrange something, and they'll be in a house for a while. The Magi at some point show up, and they enter the house, and they find the mother and the child. Now, how long after the birth before the Magi showed up? We don't know. We have different traditions, different guesses. Each one has its reasons. Doesn't matter. We do have, though, on the Christian calendar, this age-old calendar has been around for a long time. We do have a date, though, it's worth you noting, January 6th. January 6th is the Feast of Epiphany. And on January 6th, that's where those who follow that calendar, that's where they'll celebrate the coming of the Magi. Now, there's actually a lot of rigmarole that goes on the Feast of Epiphany for those who celebrate it. That's the day for giving gifts. Now, you and I will do it on December 25. We'll do it on Christmas Day as if that's the best day, and it's a good day. But those who are really into the story of the Magi, they wait. And they wait till January 6th, and when the Magi come, the ones who brought gifts, that's when they'll do their gift exchange, January 6th. A lot of other traditions go on for that day. For example, one of the traditions for children in many households is to take a box and take some kind of greenery. It could be grass right out of the yard. It could be some other kind of greenery, but put it in a box and leave it out so that when the camels come passing by overnight, they can have some grass to eat. Kind of like putting milk and cookies out for Santa, but this is putting out grass for the camels of the Magi. Another tradition is for children to take chalk and put the initials of the three Magi on the doorpost entering into a house, a sign of good luck for the coming year. Other traditions as well for the Feast of Epiphany. Now, I'll show you another picture. There's also a food tradition, a ring, which is a bread or a cake, depending on which country is baking it and the texture. But if you're around a bakery on, say, about January 5, and they bake this for people who celebrate Epiphany, feel free to grab one, give it a try, see what you think. A lot of traditions to celebrate this time when the Magi showed up to worship Christ. Well, they did show, and they did offer their worship to the Christ. And as they did so, I call it a fitting finale. A fitting finale to the story, and I'll tell you why. Because in this story, now what you've got is you've got the lowly and the high. You've got the shepherds and the Magi. You've got the locals and the far away. You've got the Jews and the Gentiles. You've got so much going on in this story, but all gathered to worship Christ. Yeah, it's good to remember that this season of the year, because from what we hear, this is a season of the year a lot of people think about going to church. Some of you think about it every week you're here or you're somewhere. But for some people, they can take an absence for a while, and around Christmas time, they're thinking maybe it's a good time to come to church. It is a good time. So why don't you take advantage of that impulse and invite. Invite family members, invite friends, invite neighbors, and say, why don't you come to church with me? Come sit with me, and I think you'll enjoy church, and it's a good time to invite people to come and worship the Christ child. Because when he came, he was worshiped by the locals and by those who are far away. They all gathered to worship the Christ. The Magi were foreigners and worshipers, and they were gift givers. They're the original Christmas gift. When they gave the gold, frankincense, and myrrh, they set the tradition. Now, a lot of times, Christians will think back to the legends of St. Nicholas. And St. Nicholas supposedly went around giving gifts at night, such as that. And so we think that's where gift giving began. No, long before St. Nicholas. We already had the three Magi. We had them giving their gifts to the Christ child. They're the real origin, the inspiration for gift giving. Now here's what Christian art has done over the centuries, even going back to the earliest times. often portray the Magi, line them up in order as they each proceed to give their gift to the Christ child. I'll show you a picture here. This is in stone, where once again you've got them lined up, each one holding something, and they walk forward and present their gift to the Christ. Here's another picture on a tapestry, same thing. Lined up, got their gifts in hand, ready to present. And the lining them up in order, that's the symbolism of the paying of tribute. See, that's what kings did back in ancient times. You've got the superior king, and here's the lesser kings of their kingdoms. And they would come on an annual basis, and they would line up, and one by one come and bow and present their gift, and the next guy, the next guy. And so oftentimes the Christian art will portray the Magi doing that same thing, giving their tribute to the superior king. Matthew tells the story, and it's a real simple story as he tells it. Matthew 2, verse 11, he just simply says, they came to the house, they saw the child, they saw the mother, and they bowed, they worshiped, they presented their gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. Folks, they're an inspiration to us. When we think about gift giving at this Christmas season, think of these fellas as they gave their gifts to Christ. Because this is the season of the year we like to exchange gifts. Families and friends, people we know and love, we'll trade off gifts. But you know, with the Magi, there's no gift exchange. It's a one-way thing. They're giving to show their respect and honor for Jesus. It's a good way for you to picture gift giving this season as well, is that you give a gift to someone because of what you want to communicate to them. You want to convey how much you love them, what you think about them, how you care. Now, whether they give something back shouldn't really matter, should it? And yet the gift exchange is so much a part of the way we think. Even as children, we started by thinking, what do I want for Christmas? We made our list. We're expecting, we're disappointed, we don't get what we wanted. Hopefully we grow up someday and realize the best way to do Christmas gift giving is to give. And don't worry about the receiving. As Jesus himself taught, it's more blessed to give than to receive. That's what the Magi teach us as they show up and they bring their gifts to convey what they want to say to the Christ child. Hope you can have that same spirit in this season of gift giving with your loved ones. But you know, it's also a good season not just for giving to those we know and love, but also to the needy we may not know so well. That's why this is a very popular time of the year for charitable organizations to get out there and try to raise funds for their worthy causes. You got the kettles and the bells ringing asking, would you make a donation to help someone who's less fortunate than yourself? It's a great season of the year to be reminded of giving, because that's in the spirit of the Magi. And so it is, we had the angel tree, which many of you took the cards and you brought in the gifts for these needy children. You filled up our lobby. It was a beautiful sight as you gave for someone else, not expecting anything in return. We got the manna boxes we'll fill on a Wednesday night. Hope you'll show up for that. It's always a big event. Gather with your friends here and you fill up those boxes and then deliver them to the homes. Likewise, we got manna ministry this Saturday, our regular monthly feeding of the needy in our community. He says it's a good season of the year to think like that, to not just give to those we know and love, but give to those that we don't know so well, but we recognize their needs. And we're in a giving spirit. We're in the spirit of the Magi. Of course, as I mentioned giving, I remember the one they gave to was the Christ child, and this is a good season to give to the Lord. To give to Jesus himself, to his ministry, to his service, to the work that's done by the church. You see, there's giving all around, that this is the season for it. And the season to do it without expecting anything back, it's just simply do it because that's the spirit I have, the spirit of the Magi. Well, they set the tone for us and they gave their gifts. Remember the gifts? Everybody memorized that since you were a child, right? Gold, frankincense, and myrrh. You know the names. Let me tell you more about those gifts. Let me start with gold. Gold, that's a valuable commodity. I don't explain what gold is. You know what gold is and what it's worth. If you're married and got a wedding ring, you probably have some idea what gold is. Now, gold is going to be very helpful for Joseph and Mary, because Joseph and Mary are going to have to stay a little extra longer down here in Bethlehem until Mary's ready to travel. Going to have to pay for that. See, Joseph is a carpenter. He's the kind of guy, he does a job, gets paid for the job, and he makes his day's wages off of the jobs he does, but he's away from his job down here in Bethlehem. He could use some income. Likewise, they're going to have to take a detour and go down to Egypt and hide from King Herod for a period of time, and that's going to cost this carpenter. And so gold will come in very handy for Joseph as he takes care of his family. Gold as a commodity. But gold also has symbolism, always has. One of the symbols of gold is royalty. See, we associate gold with kings, like a King Midas, who could touch things, they turned to gold, according to the old legend. Or a King Solomon, who actually did have a treasury filled with gold, the richest man on earth. And we associate gold with kings, and that's great at Christmas season to think about the gold that was presented to the child, because Jesus is the King of the Jews and the King of all nations. That's why, you remember that song we talked about earlier, We Three Kings? Most of the time we only sing the first verse. We don't get to the other verses, or if we do it just once a year. But when you do, look at the verses carefully. Look, for example, at that second verse where it says, talking about the king, he says, born a king on Bethlehem's plain. Gold I bring to crown him again. King forever, ceasing never, over us all to reign. The author picked up on this tradition of gold representing the child that was born to be a king. Now, in addition to gold, there was frankincense. Now, frankincense was just like it sounds. It was used for incense as well as for perfume. In incense, that would be used in a temple, like the tabernacle, for example, that Moses built, or the temple that Solomon built. And in the incense they used in those quarters, they used frankincense. Now, frank just means high quality, top of the line. So the best incense to give to God as you light it up and fill up the room with incense. And so the incense is brought to the Christ child. We've quickly picked up on symbolism there, because incense is what you offer to a deity, to God, in a temple. And thus that's become the tradition that this represents who this child is. He's more than a man. He's the Son of God. He's deity. Once again, back to our song. Here's what the hymn writer says. Frankincense to offer have I, incense for a deity nigh. You see what he's saying? Prayer and praising, all men raising, worship him, God most high. Yeah, that reminds us of who this child is. He's the Son of God. But there was also myrrh, and myrrh takes us a little bit different direction. Myrrh was used, for example, in medicine. Myrrh has a numbing effect. It was used as an anesthesia. It also was used in embalming, preparing a body for death. And it became the symbol for the death of Christ. This child who was born to die for our sins, an atoning sacrifice on the cross, and thus the death imagery comes into play. That's why the hymn writer picked up on that as well as he talked about the myrrh. Myrrh I bring, its bitter perfume, breathes a life of gathering gloom, sorrowing, sighing, bleeding and dying, sealed in a cold stone tomb. You see, that Christmas carol that's so famous was trying to tell the story of who this child would grow up to be, what his mission on this earth would be. And really, as you put them together, you've got the story of Christ. Because in the gold and the frankincense and the myrrh, you've got that he's the king, he's royalty. That he is the Son of God, he's deity, and that he came to die on the cross as a sacrifice for our sins. That's why the song finishes with one final verse. Glorious now, behold him arise, King and God and sacrifice. The King as represented by the gold, God as represented by the frankincense, the sacrifice who died for us as represented by the myrrh. It's the gospel story of Jesus Christ. I want you to remember that during this Christmas season, as you hear that familiar carol, as you think about the story that Matthew tells, and remember who this child was, that these fellows traveled so far to come and worship and give him their gifts. You know, I think about the Magi. They went to a great effort to come see Jesus. Great expense, great troubles to come see Jesus. Why? Because in their mind, he was worth it. He was something special. And he was worth what they did to come and give him the honor that he deserves. My question for you this morning is, what's Jesus worth to you? How much is he worth to you? And I hope and pray that during this Christmas season, you'll be inspired to take your life and give him what he deserves. Give him everything he is worthy of as the King, as the Son of God, as the Savior who died for us on the cross. That's the lesson we can learn from the Magi.